talk about Plutarch, a Roman citizen, although he was Greek. He's Roman because he lives during the time of the Roman Empire, lives and writes around 100 AD. So he's later than some of the other historians we've been talking about in this series on Roman historians. But he's writing about Greeks and Romans of the past who are very famous, and he compares a Greek and a Roman in this work called The Parallel Lives, or the Lives of Eminent Greeks and Romans. Now, Plutarch himself was Greek, born in Greece, was a native Greek speaker, wrote in the Greek language, and so this work was originally in Greek, not Latin. But he's still in the Roman era. Greece has now become a province of the Roman Empire, and so he properly fits within the Roman time frame, although he's Greek. As I said, Plutarch lives around 100 AD, is writing around that time, maybe a decade or two after, 110, 120, thereabout. He's born in a little town called Chaeronea, which is about 20 miles outside of Delphi. It's west of Athens. Delphi is the famous site of the Oracle of Apollo. So Chaeronea, the little town of where Plutarch's family was from, is not far from there, and he's close enough that he actually becomes involved later on in his adult life in the very important life of the sacred site of Delphi. He actually is elected to serve for a time as the priest of Apollo at Delphi, involved in whatever was going on there. He's well educated. Married, had some children, loses a child later on in life, and writes a very touching letter to his wife to comfort her at the loss of their child. Wrote a lot of other books, so we know a great deal about the life of Plutarch. We know that he traveled some to some other countries, including at least 2 trips to Rome we know about, where he taught philosophy. And in the beginning of the life of Demosthenes, he actually mentions how he learned the Latin language, which is a second language for him, since Greek was his native language. He says, just 3 or 4 paragraphs in, he says, "But for me, I live in a little town where I am willing to continue, lest it should grow less. And having had no leisure while I was in Rome and other parts of Italy to exercise myself in the Roman language, on account of public business and of those who came to be instructed by me in philosophy, it was very late and in the decline of my age before I applied myself to the reading of Latin authors. Upon which that which happened to me may seem strange, though it be true, for it was not so much by the knowledge of words that I came to the understanding of things, as by my experience of things I was enabled to follow the meaning of words. But to appreciate the graceful and ready pronunciation of the Roman tongue, to understand the various figures and connections of words and other such ornaments in which the beauty of speaking consists, is, I doubt not, an admirable and delightful accomplishment, but it requires a degree of practice and study which is not easy, and will better suit those who have more leisure and time enough yet before them for the occupation." In other words, when you're a teenager. So he says he learned Latin late in life, and he says the way he learned it is by reading books in Latin that he was already familiar with in Greek. So he learned words by things. The equivalent of this would be for you to learn, say, Latin or Greek by reading books that you've already read many times and become familiar with in an English translation. If you're familiar with the delightful children's book that all adults ought to read as well, Carry On, Mr. Bowditch, about Nathaniel Bowditch, who lived in the late 1700s, you will be familiar with this method of learning a language. And Nathaniel Bowditch, in that story, travels on ships across the world, and whenever he goes to a new country, he learns the language by reading the Gospel of John in a Bible from that country and comparing it to his English Bible. So when he travels to Spain, he learns Spanish by getting a Spanish Bible there in the port he comes to and reading the Gospel of John, since he knows it so well in his English Bible. And so he learns many languages this way. Well, that's the method by which Plutarch says he learned Latin. But he says he never became very good at it. It was very difficult for him because he was older. Learning a new language is easiest and best for those who are young and have more time to devote themselves to study. In the very beginning, back in the first paragraph of Plutarch's account of Demosthenes, he says, "For him that would attain to true happiness, which for the most part is placed in the qualities and disposition of the mind, it is, in my opinion, of no other disadvantage to be of a mean, obscure country, to be born of plain people." In other words, he says to be virtuous, to be upright, to have integrity, it may help, but it's certainly not necessary to be born of aristocratic parents in a large city and so on. He says, virtue, like a strong and durable plant, may take root and thrive in any place where it can lay hold of an ingenuous nature and a mind that is industrious. And the reason he talks about this is, and he does this at the beginning of many of his lives, is he's trying to explain his purpose in writing these stories, these accounts, these biographies, these lives of famous people. These, in the case of this particular book, is 2 volumes. It's a large work. In this work called The Lives of Eminent Greeks and Romans, Plutarch's Lives, he's not writing history. We learn a great deal of history from these, and that's why it's fitting to talk about a book like this in a section on Roman history. But his intention is not really to write history or biography. He says he's writing character sketches to inculcate virtue. And so, as we're going to see in an upcoming lecture where I talk about Plutarch's life of Alexander the Great, at the beginning of that one, he says, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in that lecture, but he says, just as a portrait painter may pay more attention to the detail on a man's face whose portrait he's painting, the fine lines around the eyes, the laugh wrinkles, or the supercilious lift of the lip and the sneer and the scowl that shows a man's character, he may pay more attention to the small details of a man's face than of the horse in the background or the castle on the hill in the background. Now, sometimes, Plutarch says, it's the small details, the way a man speaks to his wife or children or servants, the way he treats his subordinates in the military, his conversation, whether he's generous in almsgiving and so on. Sometimes it's the small details that reveal more about our character than the great events that many of us are so taken with, military exploits and political accomplishments. And so he says here and in many other places that his purpose is to show forth the lives of men whom we can emulate or not. So most of the men are great and good men, although there are some who are vicious and wicked. But those are worth reading about sometimes too, so that we know what to avoid. So just as our historian Livy says, the study of history is the best medicine for a sick mind, because in it you find the infinite variety of human experience plainly set out for all to see. And in that record you can find for yourself and your country examples, fine things to imitate, and base things rotten through and through to avoid. Plutarch agrees. History gives us the range, the gamut, the full range of character so that we can see what people are like. And Plutarch also says here and in other places that there's something interesting about the human soul. When I read about a great athlete or a great musician or a great sculptor or painter, I may admire the man's skill, but I don't necessarily want to be an athlete or a musician or a sculptor. But when I read about a man who's great in virtue, something innate in me, something in my nature, something built into us as humans wants to emulate that. So when we read the lives of great men, we're encouraged to be virtuous, noble, honorable, like them. If you've had the experience of reading the biographies of famous missionaries, George Mueller or Amy Carmichael or Hudson Taylor, many people feel moved to be like them. Maybe not necessarily to become a missionary, but to have that kind of devotion to God, to have that kind of single-minded dedication to a holy cause. That's what Plutarch's talking about. Here again, we have a pagan who's very perceptive. He says, human nature is this way. When we read about virtue, we desire to emulate it. And so he holds up in front of us, like a mirror in front of us maybe, or these portraits like paintings, examples that will stir our souls to become more virtuous. And this pattern, writing lives structured so that we can see the character of a man as more important than his great military and political and external exploits, becomes a model for many later writers in Old Western culture. Plutarch has been very, very famous and very influential in history for just that reason, because everybody recognizes that that's what he's doing. He's writing lives with a moral purpose. It's not merely for the satisfaction of the intellectual desire to know about history. He writes so that people's souls will be transformed. And so one example is in the 8th century, a monk named Einhard, who was a close personal friend for many decades of the great European leader Charlemagne, the great Frankish king Charlemagne, says he writes a life of Charlemagne based on his experience, and many people have noticed that Einhard is deliberately modeling his biography of Charlemagne after Plutarch's lives, and also the historian Suetonius. In other words, later historians are often shaped by the moral purpose that we see in these pagan historians. Plutarch's lives were very, very famous and influential in the Elizabethan age, the great age of Elizabeth Tudor, Elizabeth I, in the late 1500s, when England has this great flowering of culture, a real renaissance, an explosion of arts and literature and culture, the age of exploration, Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake. England was undergoing at that time, because of her defeat of the Spanish Armada, her discovery of the New World, and her growing power and sense of her power as a culture. England is very interested in what makes men great, because the men of England wanted to be great. The Sir Walter Raleighs and the Sir Philip Sidneys and the Edmund Spencers and the artists and the poets and the explorers wanted to be great. They were interested in what makes men's souls elevated, and so they read Plutarch. Plutarch was one of the most widely read books, used in all the schools, used in colleges, shows up on the library shelves and private collections and so on. Plutarch was very famous, very influential. And one of the most, in fact, the most famous translation at the time was by a man named Thomas North. It's the translation that Shakespeare is indebted to. Many of Shakespeare's historical plays are based on Thomas North's translations of Plutarch's lives. For example, the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar draws heavily, in fact, it's almost entirely based on Plutarch's life of Caesar through Thomas North's English translation. And Plutarch was so important to people, and North's translation was so good, that Thomas North's translation of Plutarch became one of the 4 books of the Elizabethan age that shaped English language ever after, right to our own time. Those 4 books are, of course, the King James Version of the Bible, Thomas Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer, and the works of Shakespeare, and North's translation of Plutarch. Those books have been identified as the books that were so widely read by so many literate people in the Elizabethan age and the beginning of the next age, that they shaped the sound and the rhythm and the feel of the English language. So Plutarch had a huge influence just in terms of that translator. But also the way that he sees what virtue is was deeply moving to the minds of the Elizabethan men who wanted to know what greatness is. The next age that was influenced by Plutarch was the age of the Founding Fathers in early America. Here again, modern scholars have done studies of the records, and they are very many, of the library holdings in private collections, school libraries, college libraries, and so on from all through the 1700s, the age just before the American Revolution and shortly after. From the study of these records, we know that Roman histories, after biblical studies and commentaries and theology, Roman histories were far and away the most common works of the classics that showed up on colonials' libraries. More than the Greek historians, more than the poets, Homer and Virgil, it was Roman histories. And Plutarch was one of the most popular. Plutarch was immensely influential and popular in the American colonial era just before the Revolution for exactly the same reason that it was influential in the Elizabethan age. Because at that age, when there was still a sort of desire for natural aristocracy, for educated men to learn greatness of soul through the contemplation of the good, the true, and the beautiful, Plutarch was one way of understanding that. Plutarch gives us a picture of what virtue and greatness in the men of the past are. Dante, in the late Middle Ages, around 1300s, in his famous poem, The Divine Comedy, at one point in the third portion, in the journey up through paradise that Dante takes with Beatrice as his guide up through the circles of heaven, encounters someone from Italy who says, what you've seen in hell, purgatory, and paradise, repeat when you get back onto earth as a warning for people, because you've seen the lives and the end result of the courses of action and the choices that famous people have made. It's seeing the lives of famous people that influence most of us. They're like the tallest trees in the forest that the wind beats most strongly against, that are visible from farthest off, and so on. And there Dante is appealing to this idea of Plutarch, that the lives of eminent Greeks and Romans are worth reading about because those are the men that we're most drawn to when we see them acting virtuously or otherwise. Well, so now some comments about the life of Demosthenes and of Cicero, these two great orators. Plutarch talks about Demosthenes as the greatest, in fact, he's always considered this, the greatest orator of the Greek age, of the 4th century BC. Now, this is after the golden age of Athens is over. The Athenian Empire has fallen in the Peloponnesian War. The Spartan Confederacy defeats the Athenian League. Athens' power falls. Athens begins to gain some, though by no means all, of her former power in the 4th century, that is the 300s BC. But in the middle of the century, the country to the north of the Greek city-states, the country of Macedon, governed by King Philip II, begins to grow in power and to extend its nefarious tentacles, at least that's how the Greeks saw it, down into Greece. And Philip of Macedon begins to extend his power over the Greek city-states. And so the Greek city-states are getting worried, and there are movements for liberty and independence and keeping the invaders out. And Demosthenes was a chief voice in rallying the Athenians and other Greek city-states to defend themselves against the depredations of Philip II. And so in this story, which you've read, we see that Demosthenes, who trains himself to be a good speaker, an eloquent speaker in his youth, he uses it during his adult life for the freedom and independence of Greece. One of his most famous speeches at the height of his career in fact, many of his speeches at the height of his career were directly against Philip of Macedon, and they're very powerful blasts against this foreign invader. And these speeches became so famous, and they were studied so widely all through later Old Western culture by educated people, that to this day, we still use the word philippic to mean a speech, a vehement speech against someone. So in Cicero's time, in the Roman period, when he makes speeches against Mark Antony, against Varus, the corrupt governor of Sicily, and so on, people call them philippics. So the word philippic has come to mean, because of Demosthenes, a philippic is a powerful tirade against some famous person. But before we get there, a few comments about how Demosthenes trained himself. These are famous. Demosthenes did not have a natural gift for speaking. So he trained himself by dint of hard work. In a very famous passage, we're told that Demosthenes would fill his mouth with pebbles and then try to speak clearly. And so if he could speak clearly with his mouth full of pebbles, then without pebbles in his mouth, he should be a good speaker. In another passage, we're told that he would run by the seashore and then try to declaim poetry while out of breath to force himself to increase his lung power. Because he would be tempted to go and socialize, he prevented himself, cut off that temptation by shaving half his head so he'd be too embarrassed to be seen in public and that he'd be forced to stay home and study. We're told that he built himself an underground study, dug out a cave or something, and he'd spend all night studying down there. So much so that when he first began practicing oratory in public, his speeches were somewhat artificial and somewhat contrived and a little stilted. And someone once accused him, you'll recall in the story, accused his speeches of smelling a bit of the lamp, by which they meant, sounds like you stayed up all night working on that speech, Demosthenes. And of course, there's something to that accusation. You want your speech, ideally, to seem natural and spontaneous and spur of the moment. And the harder you work at it, the less you can make it appear that you've worked hard at it. Demosthenes' early speeches looked like that he was working hard, and so they said, it smells a bit of the lamp. And Demosthenes retorts, well, yes, but at least my lamp was showing other things than yours was. In other words, his retort back is, yeah, I was staying up all night working. What were you staying up all night doing? Needle, needle. In yet another famous episode, we're told how Demosthenes first came to be interested in oratory to begin with. His tutor had heard that there's a famous orator coming to town to speak. And so his tutor smuggles Demosthenes up into the spectators' gallery where he can watch the courtroom trial going on. And in a wonderful modern parallel, if you've ever read the book or seen the movie based on the book To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, it's a wonderful Southern novel from the middle part of the 20th century, and a very famous movie made from the book starring Gregory Peck. and Robert Duvall's famous first appearance as the character Boo Radley. Well, in this novel set in the American South, To Kill a Mockingbird, a young black man is accused of raping a white girl and so on. And so this white lawyer, Atticus Finch, is defending this black man. And so all the black people in the town, this is an era, remember, of great racism in the South. So all the black people who want to come watch this white man that they admire because he's willing to defend this black guy, they all have to be up in the gallery, up in the black people's gallery up above. They're not allowed to mingle with the white people. But because the black servants in Atticus Finch's house, like the little children, Jem and Scout, who are Atticus's kids, the black servants smuggle these little children up into the blacks' gallery where they can look down and they can see for the first time what their father does for a living. He uses his words, he uses his tongue, his voice for truth, to defend people. He doesn't use his fist, he doesn't use guns, he uses words to defend truth and to ensure justice. And they're in awe of what their father does. So they see the power that he has in the courtroom with his use of language, with his mastery of eloquence. Well, that's what happens to Demosthenes. He's taken by his tutor to see this famous speaker, and he realizes what he could do with his life, and so he becomes a great orator, and sure enough, uses eloquence in defense of the liberty of Greece against Philip II of Macedon. He spoke out publicly and fearlessly against Philip when he knew that Philip was sending spies and goons down into Greece to assassinate him, because Philip knew that Demosthenes was a rallying point for the freedom fighters of Greece, and Philip wanted Demosthenes taken out. And yet Demosthenes publicly declaimed fearlessly in spite of the danger to his life. There were other episodes, though, that Plutarch tells us about in here, where we see Demosthenes failing. When he's in battle, he was guilty of physical cowardice. He couldn't face the thought of the pain of a spear and a sword, and he ran away from battle once, flinging his shield beside and leaving it under a bush and running home. We're told that he had some failures of character, but in other ways he was extremely courageous, knowing that Philip of Macedon was gunning for him, and he still stood up in public and thundered against Philip. At one point also, he was convicted of accepting a bribe. He had a little bit too much of an eye for the gold that was circulating, and someone managed to bribe him, and so he was exiled for a period of time. In his exile, he used his time well. He knew that he was guilty, and so in his exile, he traveled around and continued to stir up the freedom fighters of Greece against Philip, and eventually was restored. Finally, however, the Greek city-states do start falling to Philip of Macedon, and before Demosthenes himself can fall into the hands of the enemy, he takes poison and commits suicide. And we see Plutarch praising this action. He praises him for this honorable course of action. And this is something that we ought not to be surprised at, because in Roman culture, suicide was considered an honorable means of escaping shame, very much like the samurai culture of Japan before the modern age. Rather than be shamed, you take your own life. Or if you've been shamed, you take your life in order to restore honor maybe, or to avoid further shame on your family. So Plutarch, this Greek man living in the Roman culture, sharing this belief that suicide is admirable in certain situations, praises Demosthenes for taking his own life by poison rather than falling into the hands of the Macedonian henchmen that Philip sent out. And it's this kind of attitude towards suicide that will show up again when we talk about the early Christian writers in future lectures. Augustine, for example, in his famous Christian book, The City of God, his philosophy of history, has to talk at great length about why suicide is not right. The early Christian teachers and writers had to work hard to convince Roman Christians that this aspect of their culture was ungodly. Very much like we who are Christians in modern America are not just Christians, but we're Americans. If you're a citizen of Germany, if you're a Christian German, you're not just a Christian, you're a German. If you're a Christian Russian, you're not just a Christian, you're a Russian. And whatever country you live in, you absorb without thinking about it, many things from your culture that are not Christian, that are not biblical. And part of the job of Christians in every age and every culture is to try and sort out the baggage that we sort of breathe in, like a fish takes in water. It's the air we breathe. Many attitudes and presuppositions in our culture that are actually contrary to the spirit of our faith that we don't even see and we have to work at. So one of them, for the ancient Romans, was this attitude that suicide is honorable. Cicero, or rather Plutarch here, praises Demosthenes for committing suicide. And that's the end of his life. Then he moves on and he talks about Cicero, the famous Roman orator. Cicero, in many ways, was different. He had a more natural gift of speaking. He had to refine his gift of speaking. He had to polish his voice and his lung power and his use of words and so on. But he had more natural talent, so he didn't have to work as hard. Whereas Demosthenes was kind of a sourpuss. He was always kind of gloomy and probably had a melancholic disposition. Cicero was a little more cheerful. He's probably the kind of guy you'd rather invite to a party than Demosthenes. Demosthenes is the Eeyore in the corner. Cicero is more jovial and engaging in the conversation. The problem with Cicero's cheerfulness is that he really loved a good joke at the other guy's expense, and he could get real zingers in. If you did something to offend him, you were toast. He would make jokes at your expense, put you in your place. On the other hand, the thing that saves a person like that is when they can take a joke at their own expense, and apparently Cicero could, according to Plutarch. Cicero could laugh at jokes at his expense as well, and that makes a man like that more tolerable. Cicero also was a pleasant guy to be around because he's such a good conversationalist, but one of the topics of his conversation was the fact that he had single-handedly saved Rome from the Catiline conspiracy, which we talked about when we talked about Sallust. And eventually people got tired of hearing from Cicero how he'd saved Rome single-handedly from a disaster. But what made it really bad was that he was right and everybody knew it. So you can't hardly tell him to shut up because he's telling the truth. As he bragged a lot. He was kind of a braggart. But still, he was a decent guy. And Plutarch tells us that Cicero, unlike Demosthenes, was thoroughly upright, never took bribes, was known for his integrity and his honesty. He also was exiled, this time unjustly. He was not guilty of the thing for which he was convicted, but he was sent into exile. And here again, he was different from Demosthenes. He used his time badly. He went off and sulked. They shouldn't have done that. That was unjust. So he pouts and spends his time badly. But when he's restored, he comes back and serves Rome in political office. Cicero held a number of political offices, which Demosthenes never did. Cicero was respectable and honorable and upright in all the offices he held. And finally, Cicero, like Demosthenes, was a defender of political liberty and freedom. He was a great conservative. Cicero sided with the Senate and the Republicans and the conservatives against the populists, the Democrats, and by Democrats I mean the people who, the leaders like Julius Caesar who appealed to the people for their support. Cicero sided against Julius Caesar, even though they were personally friends and respected each other. And consequently, after Caesar was assassinated, Cicero found himself the target of many political enemies, including Mark Antony, whom Shakespeare treats fairly decently in his famous play, but Plutarch depicts Mark Antony as just a wicked man through and through. Mark Antony hated Cicero, and when Mark Antony came to power as a dictator for a short time after the assassination of Caesar, Mark Antony sent some henchmen, some goons after Cicero, and Cicero was riding in his slave carriage one day when these goons caught up with him, murdered him, cut off his head and his hands, and stuck his head and hands on pikes and displayed them on the Roman Forum for all to see, as a message from Mark Antony to say, see, this is what I will do to anybody who opposes me. He was a brutal dictator. He was an opponent of liberty. Cicero had opposed Antony, and he lost his life because of it. Plutarch doesn't praise this death. He praised Demosthenes' suicide, but not Cicero's murder. He says Cicero had been fleeing from the goons and was caught and murdered, and that's a rather ignominious way to die. So it's an interesting comparison by Plutarch about which death was more noble and more honorable. Of course, it wasn't Cicero's fault that he was murdered, and he was murdered for being an honorable man, but Plutarch says that Demosthenes' suicide was better, more noble, and more honorable than Cicero's murder while he's running from his enemies. Mark Antony, as I said, had Cicero's head and hands displayed on pikes in the Forum as a message to everybody. And an interesting side note about this is that the Forum, the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum, is called the rostra, or the rostrum. Now, this is a name that originally referred to the prow, the decorative beaks on warships. You've often seen pictures of ancient ships where there's a carved prow with a figurehead of a warrior or a god or a sea nymph or a maiden. So the rostrum meant this carved beak, this prow. In fact, I think the word means beak, but it's the prow of a warship. And when the Romans would conquer an enemy ship in a naval battle, they'd cut off this decorative figurehead and display that in the forum as a spoil of war. And eventually, the word rostrum transferred from the beak of the ship to the platform itself, and that's why they called the speaker's platform the rostrum. And to this day, we call the speaker's platform in public assembly halls and so on the rostrum or rostra. And so when Mark Antony has Cicero's head and hands displayed on pikes there at the speaker's platform, Mark Antony is saying, these are the spoils of war. I've killed this enemy, and display his head and hands as though they're the prows of the warships that he sent against me. Well, so many of the things that I've been talking about here, I've already been alluding to the comparison that Plutarch makes between Demosthenes and Cicero, how they were educated and trained. Demosthenes had to work harder. Cicero had more natural talent. How they spent their career. They both were in defense of their country's ancient liberties. Demosthenes had some weaknesses. He was guilty of a bribe. Cicero never took bribes. Demosthenes had some physical cowardice, but he was brave in the face of very obvious threats from the political enemy. Cicero was also very brave, served nobly, admirably in office. Their temperaments, Demosthenes kind of a gloomy Gus, Cicero is more of a cheerful kind of guy, and their deaths. Demosthenes commits suicide rather than let his life fall into the hands of the enemy, and Plutarch praises that. Cicero is murdered fleeing from his enemies, and Plutarch thinks less of that. So interesting insight into Roman culture and into Plutarch's mind in the way that he sees what's valuable, what's virtuous, and what's not in these two very famous orators. They're considered to be the most famous representatives of the art of rhetoric and oratory in Greece and Rome respectively, and always have been and still are to this day. And so students of the classics who have read ancient oratory to learn the use of good rhetoric have always read Demosthenes, either in the original Greek or in English translation, and Cicero, either in Latin, if you know Latin, or in English translations. One of Demosthenes' most famous speeches is called On the Crown. This is a very famous speech of his that's one of the best examples of his brilliant use of oratory. Some of Cicero's most famous speeches are those against Mark Antony, against the corrupt governor Verus, and against Catiline, of course, where he has the famous line, O tempora, O mores. And I'll talk more about Cicero and some of his speeches in a future lecture. For the next lecture, which will be on Plutarch's Life of Alexander and Life of Julius Caesar, read those two lives and pay attention to the beginning especially of the Life of Alexander, where Plutarch discusses in some detail his approach and why he's writing these lives and what he wants the reader to pay attention to and to get out of them.